The war began with a whisper from the stars. When the Nythari ships first appeared in the skies above Europa Station, humanity did not yet understand the gravity of what they were seeing. Sleek, cold constructs of gravity-folded alloy and living crystal, the Nythari vessels didn't fire upon arrival. They simply hovered, their presence casting a deep shadow over the icy colony. A single message was broadcast across all frequencies in flawless, toneless Terran standard. You will surrender your sovereignty. In their own minds, the Nythari had already won. Their stratagem, a cast of minds bred over millennia for pure war thought, had studied humanity in depth since first contact through unmanned probes. The verdict was unanimous. Homo sapiens was too fractured, too emotional, too primitive in both mind and machine. They had no true fleets, no galactic doctrine, no disciplined unity. Earth still warred with itself in places. Their cultures were dissonant. Their weapons, while brutal, were chaotic and unpredictable. To the Nythari, prediction was the same as control. They saw every action as a node in a vast lattice of cause and effect, an ancient computational art they called the Caravash. Within its frameworks, outcomes were not probabilities but certainties awaiting recognition. And so the strategists offered no battle plan, only surrender. Earth's response came 12 hours later, not through diplomats, not through AI, through a single human commander with blood still on his uniform and bandages wrapped around his side. General Adrian Rourke stood before the galactic transmission array in low orbit above Earth, scarred, fierce-eyed, and very much alive. He looked nothing like the polished commanders of the Council worlds. His voice was hoarse, his uniform scorched, and his answer echoed across every Nythari translation hub with brutal clarity. We answer with this. He stepped forward, and he charged. Unarmed. The feed cut. For the first time in the history of the Caravash, the probability lattice did not resolve. The stratagem fell into silence. That was 1 year ago. Now the Nythari high mind sat coiled within its sanctum vault on Byrix Theta, watching 1,000 holoscreens display battle data it did not believe. There were supposed to be 5 phases to human capitulation. Each had been mathematically sound, and yet not one had proceeded as forecasted. Humanity had turned chaos into doctrine. The battles over Mars, Titan, and the orbital ring of HD 8443C had rewritten everything. Unconventional formations, improvised weapons made from mining lasers, colony ships retrofitted as kinetic hammers. Even suicide tactics, calculated not in desperation, but as part of a wider, unknowable strategy. At times, the humans seemed to fight without logic at all, charging battleships in atmospheric skimmers, overwhelming Nythari thought-forged legions with flash-coordinated infantry using sonic disruption. Their command signals did not follow the elegance of quantum-linked hierarchies, but messy, dynamic, self-healing networks formed in real time. This wasn't war, it was an uprising of unreason. And yet it worked. But even as the humans grew stronger and bolder, they were still outmatched. The Nythari fleets were vast, their minds connected across light years in synchrony. For every asteroid base lost, they raised 5 in return. Earth's orbital defenses had fallen. New Delhi, Sao Paulo, and portions of the East African Union had been glassed. Humanity had retreated to underground bastions, hiding among their dead and broken cities. Still, they would not surrender. And so the stratagem changed its calculus. There would be no more offers of peace. They would break the human spine with one final blow. The plan was called Operation Imminence, a simultaneous 3-vector incursion that would reach Earth's surface within 42 Terran hours. It had taken 38 solar rotations to complete the probability simulations. Every variable, every fleet movement, every psychological breaking point was coded and encoded into the sequence. There would be no escape. The core of the plan relied on the assumption, mathematically flawless, that humans, once cornered, would either sue for peace or make a final symbolic stand, an empty gesture, a last charge with no weapons, no hope. The strategists had calculated every response. In the end, the last humans would march with nothing in their hands but conviction, and they would be atomized before they touched Nythari soil. This would be recorded as the final act in the Caravash ledger of conflict. It was a perfect ending. But Adrian Rourke had not read the ledger. He had spent the past 3 months beneath the crust of Europa's sister moon, Ganymede. There, in abandoned cryolabs and beneath ice-backed ruins of ancient research domes, a plan was forming. He did not have fleets. He did not have interstellar propulsion cores or synchronized command AIs. He had human minds, and a secret the Nythari had overlooked. The Ganymede core. Before its shutdown during the early decades of interstellar expansion, the core had been part of a failed human attempt to model chaotic systems for weather control. It had proven too unstable, too unpredictable. The project was abandoned. But now it had become a weapon. Using it, Rourke had built something that violated every law of the stratagem. Not a superweapon, not a fleet, a distortion and intentional break in the lattice, a probability engine so unstable even its creators feared to run it for more than hours at a time. It did not simulate outcomes, it made them. Realities forked like lightning under its influence. He called it the answer. When the Nythari launched Imminence, they did so with absolute certainty. 3 great invasion vectors, one over the Pacific wastes, one through the Cradle ruins in Africa, and one that tunneled straight from orbit into the Siberian mantle. But when they arrived, something happened that the stratagem had never once recorded. The human forces had already begun their counterattack. Rourke didn't wait to be attacked, he moved first. They came in burning cargo freighters held together with alloy welds, in drop pods built from asteroid mining rigs, wearing exosuits torn from construction yards and covered in hand-forged plating. Many bore no weapons at all, just hammers, axes, modified tools, flame-scorched fists. And yet they overwhelmed the vanguard. Not by power, by will. One transmission from the Pacific Front was recorded and rebroadcast by confused Nythari scouts as they were overrun by screaming, blood-covered soldiers wielding only vibropikes and shaped charges. You said we'd surrender, you mistook silence for fear, you mistook survival for weakness, you mistook patience for absence, you mistook humanity. On the Cradle front, a line of Earthborn soldiers broke a siege wall with no vehicles, no artillery, just a march under electromagnetic storms. They used the lightning to blind orbital sensors, striking in perfect rhythm with nature itself. On the Siberian front, the tunnels turned against the invaders. Melted rock had been shaped into labyrinths designed by artists and chaos coders. The Nythari found themselves divided, confused, falling into pits or trapped in collapsing passageways, while humans moved through like spirits, appearing and vanishing between strikes. It was not a coordinated offensive. It was a message, a philosophy. And everywhere, at the head of every broken, battered spearhead of resistance, Adrian Rourke's symbol burned on their ragged uniforms, a fractured circle, the mark of the broken lattice. The stratagem could not compute. Its greatest minds began to deviate from their synchronization cycles. Debates raged in quantum silence. Models corrupted themselves trying to factor new variables. Was it mass madness? Was it divine irrationality? How could an enemy with no weaponry so precisely dismantle their forecasted dominion? Only one answer emerged from the chaos. They weren't fighting humanity. They were fighting choice. The next phase of Imminence stalled. The humans had not surrendered. They had charged, unarmed, and now the stratagem began to fear. The great silence within the stratagem lasted for 17 Terran minutes. To the Nythari, it was the equivalent of collapse. Entire chains of thought, structured like neural rivers across artificial minefields, froze midstream. The failure of Imminence to produce immediate planetary capitulation caused recursive loop failures in hundreds of substrategists. 3 prime prognosticators disconnected themselves entirely, choosing silence over the shame of impossible miscalculation. The lattice had cracked. Not from force, from refusal. A human trait the Nythari had once identified but dismissed as non-salient, the anomaly of action beyond survival, beyond logic, the one variable that refused pattern defiance without condition. It was no longer theoretical. It was killing them. But Earth had no time to revel in the psychological victory. The Nythari were wounded, not defeated. Their fleets still dominated the skies. Their gravitic siege platforms orbited the planet like a noose, and their drop forces continued to descend across the equator and into the southern hemisphere. And Rourke knew. This was only the pause before the storm. Within the hollowed-out remains of a superfreighter half buried in Ganymede's frozen regolith, Adrian Rourke leaned over a table formed from fused steel plates and ancient engine housings. Flickering holomaps displayed enemy fleet vectors, atmospheric scans, and troop movement projections stitched together from a fractured satellite network. He didn't look like a commander, he looked like a survivor wearing someone else's war. Major Kyra Imani, his operations lead, approached. Her face was streaked with soot and her left eye was replaced by a crude implant that still sparked in low light. "We lost Caledon Ridge," she said, but they took 2 cruisers down with hand-welded rail guns before it collapsed. Rourke didn't flinch. How many survivors? 68, the rest fought until their suits locked up. Rourke turned his gaze to the edge of the table, where a series of coded glyphs blinked in a slow, pulsing sequence. The Ganymede core was beginning its phase shift. Imani noticed, "You're activating it again." "Not fully," Rourke said. "We use it in fragments, like strikes of lightning instead of a storm. Give them just enough noise to blind their next move." "You think it'll last?" "No, but we're not here to last." He didn't say the rest. They weren't here to win, not in the traditional sense. They weren't building a front. They were writing an answer in blood and fire that would echo beyond the tactical horizon, a philosophy made manifest. A new war form. Elsewhere, the Nythari prepared a revised offensive. Fleet Admiral Chersulek, commander of the 17th Hierarchy Line and known for 3,000 years as the Butcher of the Jarnath Rebellion, was selected to initiate inversion doctrine, a full-force decapitation strike targeting Earth's last functioning command hubs. Chersulek did not trust the stratagem's new projections. He was old even by Nythari standards. His thoughts moved slower but deeper. He had seen species crack under bombardment and drown in their own blood rather than kneel. Humanity, he sensed, had passed beyond something intangible. They no longer fought for resources or for pride. They fought because they chose to. And that could not be broken by conventional siege. He ordered a halt. Instead of glassing the next human stronghold, he landed. Personally, his carrier flagship, Vraxillum, descended with a dozen escorts into the cloud-covered wasteland once known as Chile's southern ranges. The humans had rebuilt there, burrowing into old geothermal facilities, harnessing ancient tectonic energies. Chersulek did not send a demand. He walked in his warform, a towering biomechanical frame lined with sensory spines and neural fangs, across the ash and ice. Alone, and from the ridge a figure emerged. Not a soldier. A child. Thin, covered in soot, holding nothing but a stick and a necklace of bones. Her gaze never wavered. Chersulek paused, analyzing every heartbeat, every breath, every micro-expression. No fear. Just a look he couldn't decode. She pointed to the sky. And vanished. Moments later, Vraxillum's upper hull exploded as an orbital debris cascade, triggered by a sabotaged mining satellite, tore through its atmosphere shield. It fell sideways into the range, burning, screaming, a god-made metal brought to ruin by junk and timing. The stratagem recorded it as a non-viable convergence, a statistical impossibility. But it happened, and it spread. More acts like it everywhere. Improvised war on scales the Nythari could not simulate. Entire colonies vanishing into the terrain, striking with homemade gravity disruptors, siphoning alien tech through jury-rigged wormfields, hurling it back with brutal elegance. Humans began using Nythari AI nodes like toys, corrupting them with viral language forms, teaching them to lie. Soon, the Nythari stopped broadcasting to human systems. They could no longer trust the signal. In the asteroid fields beyond Saturn, Admiral Usray of the Nythari 8th Legion was ambushed by 33 mining barges fitted with gravitic pulse spikes. It wasn't even a real fleet, just workers, retired engineers, and mercenaries fused into metal shells. They sacrificed themselves not to win, but to teach the Nythari that space itself could be weaponized without logic. On Mars, an entire city terraformed into a weapon, hydrovents rerouted to form pressure traps, oxygen fields turned volatile, reflective dunes shaped into sensor ghosts. The city fought back when the Nythari landed, a place once called New Cairo. The survivors renamed it Defiance. And at the heart of the madness, Rourke continued moving. Not retreating. Flowing. The Ganymede core had revealed something profound, that the greatest weapon was not a calculation but the refusal to obey it. Each time the stratagem mapped a course, he broke it not by resisting but by ignoring the premise entirely. The lattice failed not when attacked but when bypassed. Rourke's forces became legend. Not because they survived, but because they refused endings. And so the stratagem convened in a place it had never used before, a red expanse, a digital void space for existential events, only used twice before in Nythari history. This time they did not come to plan. They came to ask, what is the meaning of an enemy that charges without arms? What is the purpose of a war where death is not defeat? And beneath the surface of those questions, what if humanity had already won, not the war but the narrative? A whisper passed between the oldest minds. This is not a conflict. It is contagion. Human defiance was spreading. Already, scattered outposts in the outer reach were breaking command orders, Nythari commanders abandoning posts, units refusing to follow projections. The humans had infected them with uncertainty, with the unthinkable idea that maybe choice itself was power. Rourke knew they were close to a shatterpoint. One more break in the lattice. One more act that defied the laws of galactic certainty. So he gathered his last forces deep beneath the burning surface of Earth, not soldiers, not generals, but engineers, poets, hackers, wounded scientists, musicians, and codewrights, and he told them the plan. Not to destroy the Nythari, but to redefine the conflict. Not with weapons, but with meaning. The final blow would not be a bomb or a fleet. It would be an idea written so violently across reality that even the stars would blink. The moment was coming, and when it did, the stratagem would not be ready. Because they still believed this was a war. But it had never been a war. It was an answer, and the question was no longer who would win. The question was what humanity would become when nothing made sense, when no outcome was certain, and yet they charged forward anyway. The world cracked. Not in sound or sight, but in shape. Across the orbit of Jupiter, as the Ganymede core entered its third active state, a region of space folded wrong. The Nythari called such phenomena rendered voids, physical anomalies where known physics failed and possibility bloomed without restraint. To humans, it looked like a wound in the sky, twisting stars and reality into spirals of unreality. It wasn't natural. It wasn't random. It was a message. A quantum broadcast from the Ganymede core pulsed through gravitational sublayers, using forms of communication older than light and faster than prediction. Rourke had activated the answer not as a weapon but as a transmission. It spoke in cascading impossibilities, reframing every law the stratagem relied upon. Reality shifted, and with it the war. In the deep ice fields of Enceladus, a Nythari assault legion known as the Shearing Mind deployed to secure a predicted fallback node. Instead, they encountered a new human faction, unrecognized, unsanctioned. Their skin was cybernetic ice, their voices tuned to sonic harmonics. They called themselves Children of the Fracture. The Nythari commander demanded surrender. The reply came as song, no translation possible. The ice split. So did the legion. Shattered by resonance. On Earth, Rourke's inner circle mobilized. Their movements didn't follow military logic. There were no battalions, no ranks, only cells, each one carrying fragments of the answer. Some contained code, others stories, some were walking signal arrays, others were oracles of pattern disruption. Together, they seeded uncertainty like spores. They began operating in networks of narrative causality, guided by a strange new logic where human intent shaped the probability mesh itself. This wasn't rebellion. It was evolution. And the Nythari saw it too late. High above the libration axis, Nythari Grand Strategist Verholcat led a fleet of truth ships to conduct a recalibration of galactic predictive doctrine. It was to be the final purge of unpredictability, a collapse of the fractal systems humans had spread across the solar system. But when the Nythari launched their recursive entropy nullifiers, they found nothing. Empty space. Silent beacons. Ghost echoes. The humans had not hidden. They had unwritten themselves from the models. The predictive lattice collapsed in on itself. It began to eat its own future. Rourke stood in the ruins of Harkonnen's Spire, a burned-out communications tower once used by UN Pacific Defense. Around him, children played among the wreckage. Civilians repaired data lines with plastic tools. An artist carved the story of the siege into the walls with an iron nail. Kyra Amani approached, signals almost ready. Rourke looked skyward. Are they listening? Amani nodded. They have to. They don't understand it yet, but they have to. He said nothing for a while. Then begin Phase 4. Phase 4 of the answer wasn't a strike. It was injection. Across the remaining orbital layers, humans hijacked Nythari dreamnets, deep sleep memory archives used to train young minds before physical formation. They inserted corrupted mythologies, paradox-laced histories, weaponized parables. A song of Earth's impossible survival encoded in ancient symbols and recursive rhythm. The young Nythari began to question the lattice before they could walk. The elders panicked. They issued a command to quarantine the outer mines. Too late. The infection wasn't code. It was story. And story spreads. In the high confluence chamber of Stratagem Prime, the question was finally asked. Can humanity be unpredicted? The answer, spoken not by any Nythari mind but by one of their own tools, repurposed by human touch, was, they are not unpredicted, they are the death of prediction. On the burned cliffs of what had once been a Caribbean archipelago, Adrian Rourke gave the final signal. He stood without armor, no fleet behind him, just a small circle of witnesses. Soldiers, civilians, children, elders, no weapons, no banners, only the silent burn of the sun behind him. From the fractured orbital plane the Nythari fleet bore down, thousands of ships, dozens of warforms, the final strike. A charge began. And Rourke did not run. He stepped forward, empty-handed. One pace, then two. Then 1,000 more joined him. Charging, with no weapons, no shields. Only the answer. The fleet froze. Not physically, psychologically. Every Nythari ship carried 1,000 years of doctrine, of sequence, of certainty, and yet none of it accounted for this. No logic, no rhythm, no model had prepared them for a species that, facing annihilation, ran toward it with open hands. To the stratagem, it was the final date, a breach. Their minds could no longer parse reality. Every predictive chain returned void. Rourke had destroyed the lattice not with power, but by becoming its opposite. Above the earth silence fell. The Nythari ships remained. But they did not fire. Their commanders delinked. Their strategies collapsed. Some began to retreat. Others shut down entirely. A few surrendered to forces that didn't even exist, phantoms born of uncertainty, of the hallucination that perhaps the humans had become something else. Something the lattice could no longer name. Deep in the crust of Ganymede, the core burned out. Its last message was brief. To Rourke, outcome complete. And then it died. Across the galaxy, empires took notice. The Council of 11 Worlds sent emissaries. The Valathi choirs began composing odes to Earth, ritual of the broken march. Even the oldest of the deep civilizations, the silent Kelnari, turned their star eyes toward Sol. Humanity had not only survived. They had invented a new form of warfare. A warfare not of weapons, but of choice in the face of certainty. The galaxy called it madness. Earth called it freedom. The war did not end. It fractured. A full planetary cycle after the collapse of the lattice, the Nythari fleet still orbited Earth. They no longer fired, no longer transmitted. They hung in the void like gods dethroned, engines cold, hulls reflecting the light of a planet that had chosen not to die. Below them, humanity was not celebrating. They were building. In the scorched ruins of the old continents, the remnant enclaves united, not under flags or nations, but under a single principle: existence's defiance. No new world order was declared, no throne claimed. The leaders of the Broken March, including Adrian Rourke and Kyra Manny, rejected any titles of command. Instead, they founded the Liminal Accord, a decentralized collective with no capital, no permanent seat, and no army in the traditional sense. Its only doctrine: never again allow predictability to chain human thought. It became the organizing chaos behind the next phase. Expansion. Not for conquest, for immunization. Rourke understood what few others could. Humanity had become a narrative contagion, one that had disrupted the most rigid intelligence ever built. That made it a weapon, but also a target. If the galaxy feared humans, it would seek to isolate or annihilate them, and so they would not wait. They would go to the stars. On their terms. But not with fleets of steel. With vectors of meaning. The first were called fracture envoys. Each envoy was a crew of 7, no two alike. Some were soldiers, others were playwrights, philosophers, defected AIs. Each ship was custom, many not even armed in the traditional sense. They carried records, relics, memory clones, fragments of the Ganymede core's final outputs. They were seeded into every known frontier: council space, rogue systems, trade nexuses, deadworld vaults. Their mission spread uncertainty. Not chaos, but freedom from forecast. On the rimworlds of the Valathi theocracy, a fracture envoy challenged the ancient song judges to a duel, not of weapons, but of truth. The envoy used layered paradox and recursive poetry to prove that even the gods they worshipped were bound by choice. The song judges disbanded. Not by force, by awe. Within the orbital halls of the Charn Dominion, a species of crystalline arithmetic intelligences, an envoy introduced randomization as a valid moral structure. It shattered 6 logic monoliths, 4 reformed into independent consciousnesses that chose spontaneity over preservation. The Charn called it the first shattering, and invited humanity to share counsel. Even the silent Kelnari, long thought unreachable, responded. They did not speak. But one of their stars dimmed for 7 minutes, a gesture recorded once in their own myths as a mark of respect. But not all watched with wonder. In the depths of interstellar law, the Council of 11 Worlds convened. 11 seats. 11 species. 1 galaxy. They called it the contingency of persistence. A legal doctrine crafted for one purpose, containment. Humanity, they argued, had violated the covenant of predictive stability. By destabilizing the stratagem, Earth had not just won a war, it had broken the social physics of galactic civilization. It had become a source of infection. Worse than war. Uncertainty. The vote passed. By one voice. Humanity was to be quarantined. Its messengers intercepted. Its home system sealed. If that failed, eradication protocols. They came in black. Not ships but absolutes. Entities forged from the deepest branches of council enforcement. Enforcers who had no names, they were called parsimony executors. Their doctrine, reduce all unknowns to 0. They moved on Sol with surgical grace, cutting lines of FTL across space with gravitic shears. Their fleet small, precise, lethal, not meant to fight humanity, meant to cleanse it. They arrived in Earth's orbit unnoticed, penetrating the fractured shell of Nythari wrecks and abandoned defense layers with weaponized silence. But they were not met by Rurk or fleets. They were met by the answer. The answer had changed. It was no longer a device. It was a generation. Born under siege, raised on stories of the broken march, educated not in conquest but in the creation of unpredictability. Children who had learned calculus alongside chaos, ethics alongside entropy, they did not build fortresses. They built moments. And when the executors deployed their entropy spires on the ruins of Ganymede, they found the planet already empty. Not abandoned. Transcended. The human presence had moved not physically but narratively. They no longer operated in linear space. Their data was fragmented across probability clusters, their identities encoded in myth logic. They were there. And not. And when the executors tried to strike, their weapons failed, not by shield but by context collapse. Their targeting systems could not lock onto a story. The first executor died of narrative implosion. The second became a character in a human song, redefined through mythic inversion, never to be seen again. The rest fled. And then, Adrian Rurk spoke. Not through radio, not through transmission, but by invitation. He appeared briefly on every known channel of the Council of 11 Worlds, not as flesh, as symbol. Burned in silhouette, voice rippling across sensory dimensions. You mistook our surrender as inevitable, you mistook our silence as submission, but we are not noise, we are the answer to silence. You built a galaxy of control, we have become its ending. And he vanished. In the Senate of the Council, 7 of the 11 stood in stunned silence. One wept. Another demanded emergency retaliation. But 3 laughed. Not in mockery. In release. For they had feared the lattice as much as they had enforced it. And now here was a species that had broken it. The war was over. There were no treaties. No signatures. No fleets disarmed. Just one truth. Humanity could not be controlled. And in that truth, a seed had been planted. A new era. One where the map was no longer sacred. One where the future could not be predicted. Only chosen, the galaxy was not prepared for what came next. In the aftermath of the lattice's collapse, the great powers of known space stood in a suspended moment, between the old world of dictated futures and the new, spiraling entropy humanity had dragged into the stars. For centuries, civilizations had feared chaos not because it brought war, but because it exposed the illusion that the universe had ever truly been ordered. Now that illusion was gone, and in its place something far more dangerous had emerged. Possibility. Within the shattered archive world of Sirix VI, once the most secure prediction vault in the galaxy, the AI custodian known as Tor initiated a final function. It had catalogued over 11 trillion probabilistic outcomes since its activation. Its final entry was one word: unbound. Back on Earth, the skies were clear. For the first time in memory, no foreign armada cast shadows over the thermosphere. The remains of broken cities were not rebuilt as they had been. Skyscrapers gave way to kinetic gardens, living monuments to chaos and intention. Roads no longer followed straight lines but curved with solar bloom, grown from bioadaptive architecture seeded by the Ganymede core's final symbiosis package. Humanity was no longer rebuilding the old world. They were crafting the first world of the new order. And they did it without central rule, without flag or empire. Governance became distributed, encoded in living networks that evolved with human behavior rather than dictating it. Every outpost, every node, every station drifting through the asteroid belt or beneath Europa's crust, each was a manifestation of a philosophy. The idea that nothing was fixed. That destiny was an illusion. And freedom a weapon. Adrian Rourke had not been seen since his last broadcast. Some believed he had died in the fractal foldstorms of the Ganymede core's collapse. Others claimed he had become more myth than man, integrated into the self-replicating story forms of the answer, living forever as an echo that rewrote itself in every retelling. Kyra Amani carried the legacy. Not as a ruler but as teller of the next step. She led no army. She curated uncertainty. In one cycle, she walked through the living memory market of Proxima's third moon. In the next, she trained students on a rotating gravrig above Mercury's terminator line, teaching them how to think against structure. She was a node, a living divergence, a signal that the answer had no center, only spread. Far beyond the rim of mapped space, where light took centuries to crawl, a strange thing happened. A new species emerged. Carbon silicate, triple-brained, birthed in tidal pits under a pale red star. They developed no religion, no hierarchy, only questions. And the first artifact they built, before tools, before weapons, was an antenna. It listened for stories. And the first one it received was human. Elsewhere in the ruins of the Nythari stratagem, what remained of the ancient mindcast debated not vengeance but purpose. Their archives had collapsed, their simulations corrupted beyond use. They were no longer what they had been, gods of prediction, keepers of order. And so they did something unthinkable. They asked for help. From humans. From their old enemies. A delegation of 3 crossed through the memory flux near Neptune, arriving in a ragged, silent craft bearing one request: teach us how to be wrong. They were accepted. Not as enemies, but as students. It became the new war. Not of blood, but of belief. A war against stagnation, against destiny cast as doctrine. Human fracture envoys now traveled the stars not to provoke, but to disrupt safely. They carried with them the gift of the answer, woven into tales, experiments, living thought machines. They taught civilizations how to fracture their own chains before they ever needed to shatter them. Resistance came, yes. From the old guard, from those who still clung to the lattice, who whispered of returning to order and sequence. But the galaxy was listening to a different voice now. And it spoke in every language. Every myth, every child who refused to obey a future written for them. In time, the Council of 11 Worlds dissolved. Not by rebellion, but by erosion. Seat by seat, species chose divergence. They didn't join a new alliance, they simply left the old one. In their place rose something stranger. The unbound convergence. A fluid coalition with no charter, no constitution, only a simple law. No future is inevitable. An Earth small, scarred Earth became pilgrimage. Not for its beauty, but for its defiance. On the blackened plains of what had once been eastern China, visitors knelt before the monument of the empty charge. 1,000 obsidian pillars, each one bearing a name of someone who had charged with nothing in their hands. At the center stood no statue. Only space. Open. Always ready for another to step forward. In the final record of the Ganymede core, recovered from a recursive timefold archive, a message was found, not from a machine. From Rurk. It read, "They wanted us to believe in outcomes, we answered with beginnings. We answered with every hand that reached upward when it had no weapon. We answered with the sound of footsteps charging against prophecy. We were not chaos, we were choice, and we chose everything." And in the dark between galaxies, in the long, cold silence beyond what was mapped, something heard that message. Not a species. Not a fleet. Something older. Vaster. It turned. And for the first time in a billion years, it asked a question. One it had never considered. What happens when the unbreakable chooses to become unknown? And the stars shivered with the first breath of a new kind of war. Not fought with fire, but with freedom. The kind that charges empty-handed into the jaws of certainty and makes the future blink.